In 1521, a young English king wrote a book defending the Pope against a German monk called Martin Luther, wrote it himself, argued it point by point, and the Pope was so delighted he gave him a title, Defender of the Faith. And that title is still on your money if you're in Britain. It's on the coins in your pocket right now. 12 years later, that same man destroyed the Catholic Church in England. So what happened in between? What turns a man into the opposite of himself? Was it love, or was it something in his body? Because there's a serious argument that a jousting accident in January 1536 changed his personality permanently. Did he really execute 72,000 people, as one Elizabethan writer claimed? What was actually wrong with his leg, the leg that stank so badly you could smell him coming down a corridor? And why, at the very end, having buried 3 of his 6 wives and killed 2 of them, did he ask to be laid in the ground beside the one who died? We're going to walk through all of it. 100 things about Henry VIII, the real ones, the documented ones, the ones from the account books and the ambassadors' letters, and the armor that still exists and can still be measured. And I want to say this before we begin. You are not required to stay awake for this. If you drift off somewhere around the second wife, that's perfectly fine. He'll still be there tomorrow. He's been there for 500 years. So get comfortable. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders come down. There's no hurry at all in what follows. We're going to go very slowly, and we're going to start long before he was king, because the first thing you need to know about Henry VIII is that he was never supposed to be Henry VIII at all. He was the second son. That's the first thing, and everything else grows out of it. When he was born, on the 28th of June, 1491, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, downriver from London, there was already an heir. His brother Arthur was 5 years old, and Arthur was the point. Arthur had been given that name deliberately, the Arthur, the old British king, the once and future one, because their father needed all the legitimacy he could manufacture. And that's the second thing. The Tudors were new, frighteningly new. Henry's father, Henry VII, had taken the crown in battle at Bosworth Field in August 1485, 6 years before our Henry was born, and his hereditary claim to the throne was thin to the point of embarrassment. It came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, and her line descended from an illegitimate branch of the royal family that had been legitimized by Act of Parliament, with a clause, some argued, specifically excluding them from the succession. So the family that would dominate the 16th century began as an improvisation. A man who won a battle and then spent the rest of his life making the win look inevitable. The third thing is what that meant for the boy. Second sons in royal families were spares, and spares were kept close, kept safe, and given no particular function. Arthur was sent off at a young age to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border to learn to govern, to be a prince in practice. Henry stayed at Eltham with his sisters, in the household of women and tutors. And there's a real argument among historians that this shaped him more than anything else. He was raised the way a clever, indulged, closely supervised child is raised, rather than the way a king is raised. He had the education, though, and it was a superb one. The fourth thing is that we have an eyewitness to Henry as a child, and the eyewitness is one of the greatest scholars in Europe. In the autumn of 1499, the humanist Desiderius Erasmus was visiting England, and a young lawyer friend of his took him on a walk to Eltham Palace without warning him where they were going. The friend was Thomas More, and yes, that Thomas More, and hold that name, because in 36 years it will matter enormously. They were shown into a hall, and there were the royal children, and Henry, aged 8, was standing in the middle of them with a bearing that Erasmus never forgot. He wrote later about the boy's presence, something regal already in the set of him. And then More stepped forward and presented the prince with a piece of writing he'd brought as a gift. And Erasmus, who had brought nothing, was mortified. The fifth thing is what happened at dinner. A servant came to Erasmus with a note from the 8-year-old, politely asking for something from his pen. A challenge, in other words, from a child, in front of everybody. Erasmus was furious and embarrassed, and went away and spent 3 days writing a long Latin poem in praise of Britain and its royal family, and sent it. Think about that for a second. The most famous intellectual in Europe, got at by a small boy, and stung enough to work for 3 days to save face. That's Henry at 8. And there's something in that story, the charm, the confidence, the instinct for putting other people slightly on the back foot, that you'll recognize in every phase of his life. The sixth thing is Arthur's marriage, which was the great achievement of Henry VII's foreign policy. In November 1501, Arthur, aged 15, married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the monarchs who had just united Spain, taken Granada, and funded Columbus. This was the Tudors marrying into the biggest name in Europe. It was the seal of approval the dynasty had been begging for. And 10-year-old Henry led the bride up the aisle of Old St. Paul's Cathedral. He walked her to his brother. The seventh thing is that Arthur died. In April 1502, at Ludlow, less than 5 months after the wedding, of something the sources describe vaguely, possibly a sweating sickness, possibly consumption, possibly plague. He was 15, and the household at Ludlow was so afraid to tell the king that they sent for his confessor, and had the confessor break it. There's a detail from that morning that has stayed with me. Henry VII, hearing the news, sent for his wife, Elizabeth of York. And she came, and she comforted him. She reminded him that his mother had only ever had one child, himself, and God had preserved him, that they were still young, that they had another fine son. And she held herself together in front of him. And then she went back to her own chamber and broke down completely. And her ladies had to run and fetch the king, who came and comforted her in turn. 400 years on, that's still one of the most human things in the entire Tudor archive. 2 people taking turns to be the strong one. The 8th thing is that Elizabeth of York then did something that killed her. Perhaps in response to that loss, she became pregnant again quickly, and in February 1503 she gave birth to a daughter at the Tower of London, and the baby did not live long, and 9 days later, on the 11th of February, her 37th birthday, she died too, almost certainly of a postpartum infection. Henry was 11. He had lost his brother and his mother inside 10 months, and there's a letter he wrote years later, in his 20s, to Erasmus, saying that he had never been given news less welcome than the news of his mother's death, that it had been the worst thing he had ever heard. The 9th thing is what those years did to his father. Henry VII after 1503, changed. He had always been careful with money. Now he became something else. He and his agents pursued the nobility with a system of fines, bonds, and recognizances, essentially forcing great men to sign enormous financial guarantees for their good behavior, so that at any moment the king could ruin them. Two of his most effective enforcers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, became the most hated men in England. It worked. The crown got rich and the nobility got quiet. But it made the last years of the reign cold and unpopular. And the 10th thing is that the prince spent those years under lock and key. The Spanish ambassador reported that the young Henry was kept so closely that he could only be seen through a window, that he lived in a room off his father's, entered only through his father's chamber, that he did not speak in public unless it was to answer his father. He was in his teens. He was 6 feet tall, athletic, brilliant at everything he tried, and being kept like a jewel in a locked case because he was now the only male Tudor left alive, and his father was terrified of losing him. Hold that picture in your mind. A big, charming, energetic young man, cooped up and watched, waiting. Because on the 21st of April, 1509, the door opened. The 11th thing to know is that his father's death was concealed for 2 days. Henry VII died at Richmond Palace on the 21st of April, and the news was held back until the 23rd, while the men around the throne arranged matters. And among those arrangements was the decision, made almost immediately, to arrest Empson and Dudley. It was a masterstroke of public relations. The new reign began with the sacrifice of the old reign's tax collectors. They were both executed the following year on a charge of treason that was, by most accounts, entirely manufactured. Their real crime was being unpopular on the previous king's behalf. The 12th thing is that England went slightly mad with joy. Henry was 17. He was tall. His armor tells us he was around 6'1" or 6'2", which in 1509 made him a giant. He was handsome, red-gold-haired, a superb horseman, a fine musician, a linguist, a scholar. After 24 years of a gray, suspicious, money-counting king, here was a golden boy. The poet John Skelton wrote that the rose both white and red was in a garden planted. Thomas More wrote a coronation ode. And Lord Mountjoy wrote to Erasmus a letter that has become famous, saying that heaven and earth rejoiced, that everything was full of milk and honey and nectar, that avarice had been expelled, and generosity scattered wealth with a bounteous hand, and that this king desired not gold or gems, but virtue, glory, immortality. Sit with that for a moment. That's the reputation he began with. Not tyrant, not monster. The exact opposite. The hope of Europe. The 13th thing is that within weeks of his accession he married his brother's widow. Catherine of Aragon had been stranded in England for 7 years. Poor, neglected, used as a bargaining chip, while the 2 kings haggled over her dowry, sometimes genuinely short of money for food and clothing for her household. She was 23. Henry was 17. They married privately at Greenwich on the 11th of June, 1509, and were crowned together at Westminster Abbey on the 24th. And Henry said in writing that he married her by his own choice, that if he were still free, he would choose her above all others. Now here's what matters for everything that follows. This marriage required a papal dispensation, because canon law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. The dispensation had been granted years earlier by Pope Julius II. It was in place. It was legal, nobody disputed it. Remember that. It's going to become the most argued over piece of paper in Europe. The 14th thing is that Catherine was not a decorative queen. She was highly educated, taught by humanist scholars, fluent in Latin, a correspondent of Erasmus, and she had been raised by Isabella of Castile, a woman who commanded armies. Catherine had watched her mother run a war. That upbringing paid off in 1513. Henry, desperate for the kind of martial glory his ancestors had won at Agincourt, took an army to France, and while he was away, he left Catherine as regent of England, governor of the realm, and the Scots invaded. The 15th thing is what happened next, and it's one of the great ironies of the reign. In France, Henry won a small, showy engagement near Terouanne on the 16th of August, 1513, in which the French cavalry broke and ran so fast the battle got the nickname the Battle of the Spurs. It was a skirmish, dressed up as a triumph. Meanwhile, on the 9th of September, at Flodden in Northumberland, an English army raised under Catherine's regency destroyed the Scottish army completely. James IV of Scotland, Henry's own brother-in-law, married to his sister Margaret, was killed on the field along with a large part of the Scottish nobility. It was the most catastrophic defeat in Scottish history, and Catherine wrote to Henry about it, and she sent him as a trophy a piece of the dead king's bloodied coat. She said in the letter that she had thought of sending the body itself, but that Englishmen's hearts would not suffer it. She was managing him even then, her great victory delivered to him as a gift wrapped in modesty. The 16th thing is that Henry was, by any measure, a genuinely gifted musician. This isn't flattery from courtiers. There is a manuscript in the British Library known as the Henry VIII manuscript, containing over 100 pieces, and around 33 of them are attributed to the king himself, about 20 songs and 13 instrumental works. He played the lute, the organ, the virginals, and the recorder. At his death, his inventory listed dozens of instruments, including something like 78 recorders. His best-known song is called Pastime with Good Company, and its argument is essentially that a young man is entitled to enjoy himself, that idleness breeds vice, and that company and hunting and music are honest pleasures. It was popular across Europe in his lifetime. The 17th thing, and I'm sorry to do this, is that he did not write Green Sleeves. He gets the credit constantly. But the tune's style points to a later period, and it first appears in the record in 1580, registered at the Stationers' Company in London, more than 30 years after Henry's death. It's a lovely story. It isn't true. The 18th thing is the jousting, and you have to understand how dangerous this was to understand him. Henry was a serious competitor in the tilt-yard, not a ceremonial one. He rode in armor at speed against other armed men with a lance, and the sport killed people regularly. In 1559, it would kill Henry II of France, when a splinter went through his visor into his eye and brain. Henry had near misses. In 1524, he forgot to lower his visor and took a lance strike to the head, filling his helmet with splinters. His opponent, the Duke of Suffolk, was reportedly so horrified he swore never to run against the king again. Another time, vaulting a ditch with a pole while out hawking, the pole snapped and he went head first into muddy water and had to be pulled out by a footman. He kept doing it. He was, for the first half of his life, a man addicted to physical risk. The 19th thing is the most extravagant party in English history. In June 1520, near Calais, at a place called Ballingham, Henry met Francis I of France for a summit of pure display, remembered as the Field of Cloth of Gold. It lasted about 2.5 weeks. Temporary palaces were built. Fountains reportedly ran with wine. Thousands of sheep and hundreds of other animals were consumed. Both kings competed in the lists, jousted, feasted, and swore friendship. And the story goes, and it is only a story, though it's reported by more than one source, that at some point Henry seized Francis and challenged him to wrestle, and Francis threw him. If it happened, imagine the silence afterward. The 20th thing is the man who organized it all, and he's one of the most remarkable figures of the century. Thomas Wolsey was the son of an Ipswich tradesman, a butcher, according to the sneers of his enemies. He rose through the church and through sheer administrative brilliance until he was Archbishop of York, a cardinal, Lord Chancellor of England, and papal legate. For roughly 15 years he effectively ran the country. And he lived like an emperor. He built Hampton Court. He had a household of hundreds. Ambassadors dealt with him rather than the king. There's a Venetian account of him processing to Westminster Hall with silver crosses carried before him and the Great Seal, and a servant bearing an orange hollowed out and filled with a sponge soaked in vinegar, which the cardinal held to his nose to keep off the smell of the crowd. The 21st thing is why Wolsey could do that, because Henry, in these years, did not much like the desk work. He hunted, he jousted, he composed, he wrote theology, he hated writing letters. There's a wonderfully petulant note in one of his own where he complains about the pain of writing. Wolsey handled the government and Henry signed things. But, and this is essential, Henry always knew what he wanted, and Wolsey's power existed entirely at his pleasure. Every minister in this reign made the same mistake eventually. They mistook indispensability for safety. The 22nd thing is the book. In 1521, in response to Martin Luther's attacks on the papacy, Henry produced the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, the defense of the 7 sacraments. How much of it he wrote himself is debated. Thomas More admitted to being involved as an editor and sorter of arguments. But Henry certainly worked on it, and cared about it, and was proud of it. Pope Leo X rewarded him with the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. And here's the thing that makes people laugh when they realize it. After the break with Rome, the Pope revoked the title, and Parliament simply granted it back by English statute. So it stayed, and it is still there today, abbreviated on British coinage as FD or FIDDEF, a Catholic honor for an anti-Lutheran book awarded by a pope, kept by a king who destroyed the pope's authority in England, still stamped on the coins of a Protestant country 500 years later. Luther, by the way, replied to the book. He was not gentle. He called Henry a number of things that would not be appropriate for a bedtime story. The 23rd thing, and here the shadow starts to come across everything, is the pregnancies. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant at least 6 times. A daughter, stillborn, in 1510. Then a son, born on New Year's Day 1511, named Henry, Prince of Wales, and the celebrations were enormous. The king held a great tournament at Westminster, and rode under the name Sir Loyal Heart. Bells rang, bonfires burned. The baby died on the 22nd of February, aged 52 days. Then another son, born and died in 1513. Another in 1514. Then in February 1516, a daughter who lived, Mary. And then in 1518, a final pregnancy that ended in a stillborn or short-lived daughter. The 24th thing is what Henry said when Mary was born, and it's genuinely poignant, because at the time it was optimism. He told the Venetian ambassador that they were both young, and if it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, the sons would follow. They didn't. The 25th thing is that he did have a son, just not with her. In 1519, his mistress Elizabeth Blount gave birth to a healthy boy, Henry Fitzroy. And in 1525, the king did something extraordinary. He publicly acknowledged the child and elevated him, at 6 years old, to Duke of Richmond and Duke of Somerset, with precedence over everyone at court. Which was a signal. It told every ambassador in Europe that the king was thinking about the succession, that he could father sons, and that he was prepared to consider unusual solutions. The boy died in 1536, aged 17, and that particular door closed. But by then, everything had already changed. Now, here's where the story turns, and I want to take it slowly, because the popular version is too simple. The popular version is that Henry fell in love with a woman and blew up a church to have her. The truth is messier and, I think, far more interesting. The 26th thing to know is that Henry became convinced he was cursed, not metaphorically, scripturally. There is a verse in the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, which says that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, and they shall be childless. Henry had married his brother's widow. He had no living son, to a mind steeped in providential thinking, and his was. That was not coincidence. That was a verdict. The 27th thing is that there was a perfectly good counter-argument, and everybody knew it. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, commands the opposite, that if a man dies childless, his brother shall take the widow and raise up offspring for him. Two passages, flatly contradictory. Centuries of theologians had reconciled them, which is precisely why the papal dispensation had been granted in the first place. But Henry did not want reconciliation. He wanted Leviticus, and once he had decided, he never wavered, not for one recorded moment, over more than a decade. This is one of the defining features of the man, an absolute, sincere, unbudgeable conviction that whatever he wanted was also what God wanted. The 28th thing is Catherine's counterposition, which was simple and devastating. She swore, publicly and repeatedly and under oath, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she had come to Henry a virgin, which meant the Leviticus verse did not apply because there had been no true marriage to his brother at all. It came down to what had or had not happened in a bedroom at Baynard's Castle in November 1501, between two 15-year-olds, one of whom had been dead for a quarter of a century. The 29th thing is the moment Catherine spoke for herself, and it is one of the great scenes of English history. In June 1529, a legatine court convened at Blackfriars in London to try the case. Catherine was summoned, and instead of answering the court, she got up, crossed the floor, and knelt at Henry's feet in front of everyone. And she asked him what she had done to offend him. She said she had been a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to his will. She said she had loved all those he loved for his sake, whether she had cause or not. She reminded him that when he married her, she was a true maid without touch of man. And she said, and I paraphrase closely here, whether that is true or not, I put it to your conscience. Then she stood up, made a low curtsy, and walked out of the court. She was called back 3 times. She kept walking. She never appeared before that court again. And the case, in the end, collapsed. The papal legate adjourned it to Rome, and it was over. The 30th thing is why the Pope could not simply say yes. Popes had granted these things before. But in May 1527, imperial troops had sacked Rome, and Pope Clement VII was effectively at the mercy of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Think about the geometry of that for a second. Henry's entire matrimonial crisis hung on a pope, who was, in practical terms, a prisoner of the Queen's own family. It's one of history's great pieces of bad timing. If the sack of Rome had not happened, Henry might well have got his annulment quietly, and England might still be Catholic. The 31st thing is Anne Boleyn, and she was not, as the caricature has it, a passing infatuation. She had spent formative years at the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, and then at the French court, where she served Queen Claude for several years. She came back to England in around 1522 as something genuinely unusual. An Englishwoman with the manners, the wit, the dress sense, and the religious reading of the French court. Her sister Mary had already been Henry's mistress. Anne refused to be. The 32nd thing is that we know what Henry wrote to her, because 17 of his love letters survive, and they survive in one of the strangest places imaginable. They are in the Vatican Library. Nobody is quite sure how they got there. The most common explanation is that they were stolen from Anne's possession by someone hoping to use them as evidence in Rome. So Henry's private letters to the woman he was trying to marry ended up in the archive of the institution that was refusing to let him. And they are worth knowing about, because Henry, remember, hated writing. In one letter, he complains about being away from her, and says he wishes himself, particularly one evening in a certain place, which is about as explicit as 16th century royal correspondence gets. In another, he signs off with her initials inside a drawn heart. A man who resented writing a page of state business was sitting up at night drawing hearts. The 33rd thing is the fall of Wolsey, which happened because he failed to deliver. He had promised he could get the annulment. He couldn't. And in the autumn of 1529, he was stripped of the chancellorship, charged under an old statute, and sent north to his archbishopric, a place he had held for years and never once visited. He was arrested for treason in November 1530 and began the journey south to London and, almost certainly, execution. He fell ill on the road and died at Leicester Abbey on the 29th of November. And his last words, as reported by his gentleman usher George Cavendish, who was there, are among the most quoted in English history, that if he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have given him over in his gray hairs. The 34th thing is that Wolsey's fall left a hole, and into it stepped 2 men who could not have been more different. Thomas More became Lord Chancellor, a lawyer, a humanist, a friend of Erasmus, and an absolutely committed enemy of heresy. And Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son from Putney who had been Wolsey's own servant, began his climb. Cromwell's early life reads like fiction, and much of it is genuinely obscure. He seems to have left England as a teenager, fought or served in Italy, worked in the cloth trade in the Netherlands, learned languages, learned banking, learned law, and come back a formidably capable man with no family, no land, and no advantages except his mind. The 35th thing is Cromwell's idea, and it changed English history permanently. Everyone else had been trying to solve the problem inside the existing system, persuade the Pope, argue the canon law, find a friendly court. Cromwell's proposal was to change the system. If the Pope had no authority in England, then no permission was needed. The 36th thing is the legal machinery, and I want to name one document because the sentence in it is extraordinary. In 1533, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which blocked any appeal to Rome from an English court, and its preamble opens with the assertion that, by various old histories and chronicles, it is manifestly declared that this realm of England is an empire. An empire, meaning, in the legal language of the time, a sovereign jurisdiction answering to nobody outside itself. That single clause is one of the foundation stones of the modern English state. The 37th thing is the timing, which was tight. Anne became pregnant around December 1532. She and Henry married secretly in January 1533, while he was still, in the eyes of Europe, married to Catherine. Thomas Cranmer, newly made Archbishop of Canterbury, held a court at Dunstable in May and declared the first marriage null and the second valid, and Anne was crowned on the 1st of June, visibly pregnant. And on the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich, she gave birth. It was a girl. The 38th thing is a beautiful small detail from that day. The official letters announcing the birth had already been written in advance, with the word Prince in them. And rather than rewrite them, a clerk simply added a letter, turning Prince into Princess, the spelling then used for princess, an S squeezed onto the end of a word. That's the physical trace of the disappointment. The child was named Elizabeth. She would rule England for 44 years and give her name to the age. The 39th thing is the Act of Supremacy of 1534, which declared the king to be the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Not made him, declared him. The wording matters. Parliament was not granting a power. It was recognizing one that had, in this theory, always existed and been usurped by Rome. And alongside it came a new Treasons Act, which for the first time made it treason to deny the king's titles in speech, not just in deed. Words became a capital offense. The 40th thing is the oath, and this is where it turned bloody. An oath was required, acknowledging the succession through Anne's children, and, by implication, the whole new order. Most people took it. Almost everyone took it. Thomas More refused. He did not denounce it. He was far too good a lawyer for that. He simply declined to swear and declined to say why, on the grounds that silence in law implies consent, not denial. The 41st thing is that his silence was not enough, and the trial that convicted him in July 1535 turned on the testimony of the Solicitor General, Richard Rich, who claimed More had spoken treasonous words in the Tower. More's response was to point out that Rich had never been considered trustworthy by anyone who knew him, and to ask whether the court really believed that he, who had kept his mouth shut before the great men of the realm, would suddenly unburden himself to Richard Rich. He was condemned anyway. And on the scaffold, on the 6th of July, 1535, he asked the crowd to pray for him, said he died the king's good servant and God's first, and, by several accounts, moved his beard aside from the block, remarking that it at least had committed no treason. The 42nd thing is that Bishop John Fisher had gone to the block 2 weeks earlier, on the 22nd of June. And there's an aggravating detail. While Fisher was imprisoned, the Pope made him a cardinal, presumably hoping it would protect him. Henry, according to the reports, said that Fisher could have the hat, but he would have no head to wear it on. The 43rd thing is that these executions shocked Europe in a way the earlier proceedings had not. Erasmus, who had known More for decades, wrote that in More's death he felt as if he himself had died. Charles V reportedly said that if he had had such a servant, he would rather have lost the best city in his dominions. The 44th thing is that Catherine of Aragon died on the 7th of January, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle, having been kept away from her daughter Mary for years, and having refused, to the very last, to accept any title but Queen. Her final letter to Henry, its authenticity is debated by historians, so treat it gently, ends by saying that she pardons him everything and desires that God will also pardon him, and closes with the line that her eyes desire him above all things. The 45th thing is what Henry and Anne did when the news arrived. They dressed in yellow. They held a celebration. Henry carried the little Princess Elizabeth around the court, showing her to people. Historians argue about the yellow. In some contexts, it may have been a Spanish color of mourning. But the celebrating is not really in doubt. And within 5 months, Anne herself would be dead. If you're drifting a little now, let yourself. We're coming to the year that broke him, and I'll go gently. The 46th thing to know is that on the 24th of January, 1536, at Greenwich, Henry rode in the tilt-yard in full armor and was thrown. The horse, also armored, came down on top of him, and he lay unconscious, the reports say for around 2 hours. He was 44, and a good many historians now believe that the man who got up from that fall was not quite the same man who had fallen. The 47th thing is what the theories actually are, because you'll hear them stated far too confidently. One argument is traumatic brain injury, that damage to the frontal lobes could account for the rages, the suspicion, the memory problems, and the terrifying unpredictability that mark his later years. Another, proposed in 2010 by the researchers Katrina Banks-Whitley and Kira Kramer, is that Henry carried the Kell blood group antigen, which can cause a woman's later pregnancies by the same man to fail, and that he may also have developed McLeod syndrome, a related condition that can bring on physical decline and personality change in middle age. I want to be honest with you. These are hypotheses. They are not established fact, and other historians find them unpersuasive. Nobody has tested Henry's DNA. But something changed. On that much, almost everyone agrees. The 48th thing is what happened 5 days later. On or about the 29th of January, the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Anne Boleyn miscarried, and the fetus, by the report of the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, appeared to have been a male of about 15 weeks. She had lost a son. On the day her predecessor was buried. The 49th thing is how fast it then went. In late April 1536, a court musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and, under conditions we cannot reconstruct but can guess at, confessed to adultery with the Queen. Within days, 4 more men were taken, including Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest personal servants, and Anne's own brother George, Lord Rochford. On the 2nd of May, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower. On the 15th, she was tried in the King's Hall of the Tower before a court of peers presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. On the 17th, the 5 men were executed. On the 19th, she died. 17 days from first arrest to the Queen's execution. The 50th thing is that the charges do not survive scrutiny. Modern historians have gone through the dates and places specified in the indictment and found that in a number of cases Anne was demonstrably somewhere else, or had recently given birth, or the man named was elsewhere. Some historians argue Cromwell manufactured the whole thing. Some argue Henry needed it to be true, and the machinery obliged. Almost nobody now believes the accusations as charged. The 51st thing is a detail I find unbearable and also revealing. She was not beheaded with an axe. An expert swordsman was brought over from Saint-Omer in the territory of Calais to do it with a sword, a French method, cleaner, and requiring no block. That swordsman had to be sent for, which means that while the trial was still running, before any verdict had been returned, someone had already crossed the channel to fetch an executioner. The 52nd thing is what Anne said in the Tower, and it shows a woman with her wits terrifyingly intact. She joked with her jailer, Sir William Kingston, about the manner of her death, saying she had heard the executioner was very good and that she had a little neck, and putting her hands around it and laughing. Kingston wrote to Cromwell reporting it, and noted, almost helplessly, that he had seen men and women executed, and they had been in great sorrow, but that this lady had much joy and pleasure in death. The 53rd thing is her scaffold speech, which is a master class in survival, not her own, but her daughter's. She did not protest her innocence. She could not. Anything that sounded like an accusation against the king could have destroyed Elizabeth. So she praised him. She called him a good and gentle and sovereign lord, and asked the crowd to pray for him, and said that if any person meddled in her cause, she asked them to judge the best. She spent her last public words protecting the child. The 54th thing is that Archbishop Cranmer, who owed his position to Anne, and who was fond of her, wrote a letter to Henry that is a small, agonized masterpiece of political self-preservation, saying that he was clean amazed, that he had never had a better opinion of any woman, but that, of course, he would obey the king in all things. You can watch a man trying to save a friend and save himself in the same paragraph, and failing at the first. The 55th thing is that 11 days after Anne's execution, on the 30th of May, 1536, Henry married Jane Seymour. 11 days. The 56th thing is that Jane is the wife people find hardest to read because she left so little behind. Her motto was bound to obey and serve. She had been a lady-in-waiting to both previous queens. She was quiet, conservative in religion, and she did one thing of real political consequence. She reportedly knelt before Henry in public and begged him to restore the abbeys during the Northern Rebellion, and he told her sharply to get up and not meddle in his affairs, reminding her of what had happened to the last queen who did. She did not raise it again. The 57th thing is what she achieved, and it cost her everything. On the 12th of October, 1537, at Hampton Court, after a labor reported to have lasted around 2 days and 3 nights, she gave birth to a boy. Edward. The country went off its head with relief. Bonfires, bells, 2,000 rounds fired from the Tower guns. And on the 24th of October, 12 days later, Jane Seymour died, almost certainly of a postpartum infection, the same thing that had killed Henry's own mother. The 58th thing is that Henry wore black for 3 months and did not remarry for over 2 years, which for him was an eternity. And when he died a decade later, having married 3 more times, his will directed that he be buried beside her. She was the one who gave him the son. She was also, conveniently, the only one who never lived long enough to disappoint him. Now, let's back up slightly, because in the middle of all this, the greatest transfer of property in English history was underway. The 59th thing is the Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535, a nationwide survey of the wealth of every religious house in England and Wales, carried out at enormous speed by commissioners in a matter of months. It was an audit, and an audit is what you do before an acquisition. The 60th thing is the scale of what followed. Beginning in 1536, with the smaller houses and rolling on through 1539 to the great abbeys, something in the region of 800 monasteries, priories, friaries, and nunneries were closed. Their land, their rents, their plate, their bells, and their lead roofs went to the crown. Perhaps 10,000 monks, nuns, and friars were turned out. Many were pensioned. The heads of houses who cooperated often did very well. Others got very little. The 61st thing is what it did to the landscape, and you can still see it today. Fountains Abbey, Rievaulx, Tintern, Glastonbury. Those roofless walls standing in fields all over Britain are not the work of time. They are the work of policy. Once the lead was stripped from a roof, English weather did the rest within a generation, and the money did not stay. It was spent largely on war with France and Scotland in the 1540s, and on coastal fortifications. The single greatest windfall in the history of the English crown was substantially burned through inside a decade. The 62nd thing is that not everybody accepted it quietly. In October 1536, a huge rising began in Lincolnshire and spread across Yorkshire and the north, the Pilgrimage of Grace. At its height, the rebels may have numbered 30,000 or more, which was far larger than any force the king could immediately put in the field. They carried banners of the 5 wounds of Christ. They were not mostly a rabble. They included gentry and lawyers, and their leader was a barrister named Robert Aske. And the way it ended tells you a great deal about Henry. The Duke of Norfolk, badly outnumbered, negotiated. He offered a pardon and a promise of a parliament in the north to hear their grievances. The rebels believed it and went home. Then a small, fresh disturbance broke out in early 1537, and the king used it as a pretext to declare the pardon void. Aske was arrested, taken to York, and hanged in chains from the tower of Clifford's Tower. Some accounts say he was hanged alive in chains and left to die. Around 200 people in total were executed. He had come to London at Christmas as an honored guest of the king. Henry had received him warmly, given him a jacket of crimson silk, and asked him to write an account of the rising. Then he killed him. The 63rd thing is the portrait, and it's probably the most consequential painting ever made in England. By 1539, Henry was a widower and diplomatically isolated. France and the Empire had made peace, and a Catholic alliance against schismatic England was a real possibility. Cromwell's answer was a German marriage to the sister of the Duke of Cleves, a useful Protestant-leaning principality on the Rhine. But nobody at the English court had seen her. So Hans Holbein the Younger, the king's painter, was sent to the Rhineland to produce a likeness of Anne of Cleves. The 64th thing is that the resulting portrait, a small, exquisite thing, painted on parchment, mounted on canvas, now in the Louvre, is not a flattering fantasy. Holbein was a ruthlessly honest painter. Anne is shown calm and steady, with a broad face and downcast eyes. It's a good, sober, careful likeness. Henry saw it, and the negotiations went ahead, and Anne came to England at the very end of 1539. The 65th thing is what he did next, and it was a catastrophe of his own making. Henry decided to surprise her. Steeped in the conventions of courtly love, in which a disguised knight approaches his lady and is recognized by the force of true love alone, he burst in on her at Rochester, unannounced, in disguise, with a group of companions, and embraced and kissed her. Anne of Cleves had no idea who this large stranger was. By the account of one of those present, she was startled and displeased, and turned back to watching the bull-baiting out of the window. He left the room, changed into royal purple, and came back as himself. And the damage was done. It was not the portrait that ruined it. It was the humiliation. The 66th thing is that they married on the 6th of January, 1540, and the marriage was never consummated, and Henry complained to his doctor in terms so ungallant I won't repeat them all. The marriage was annulled in July, after roughly 6 months. And here is the extraordinary part. Anne of Cleves agreed. She did not fight. She accepted the annulment, wrote to her brother telling him she was content and well treated, and that he should not make trouble. The 67th thing is what she got for it. She was given the title of the king's beloved sister, and precedence over every woman in England except the king's future wife and daughters. She was given Richmond Palace, Bletchingley, and later Hever Castle, which had been the Boleyn family home. She had an income, servants, and complete independence, which was a nearly unheard-of position for a woman in the 16th century. She outlived Henry by 10 years. She outlived every one of the 6. She died in 1557, in the reign of Mary I, and she is buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of the wives who is. The woman who lost is the one who ended up with a palace, an income, no husband, and a tomb among kings. I'd call that a win. The 68th thing is that Cromwell paid for the marriage with his life. He had risen impossibly high, Earl of Essex, Lord Great Chamberlain, in April 1540. 10 weeks later, he was arrested at the council table, his badge of office torn off, and taken by barge to the Tower. He was condemned by Act of Attainder, a device by which Parliament simply declares someone guilty without trial, and executed on the 28th of July, 1540. The reports say the executioner made a mess of it. The 69th thing is that Henry married Catherine Howard that same day, or within days of it. And the 69th and a half thing, if you'll allow it, is that within months the king was reportedly complaining loudly about the loss of Cromwell, saying he had been the most faithful servant he ever had, and blaming his counselors for turning him against the man. He killed him, and then mourned him, and then blamed everyone else. That pattern repeats. The 70th thing is Catherine Howard, and this part of the story is genuinely sad rather than scandalous. Her exact birth date is unknown, but she was probably around 19 when she married Henry, who was 49, enormously fat, and had an ulcerated leg that sometimes had to be lanced. She had been raised in the crowded household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, with minimal supervision, where, as later testimony described, young women and young men of the household had access to the maiden's chamber at night. She had had a relationship with her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and a serious one with a gentleman named Francis Derham, who had called her his wife, and to whom she may have been contracted. The 71st thing is that all of this came out through the ordinary Tudor mechanism of somebody talking. A man named John Lascelles reported what his sister, who had served in that household, had told him. It reached Cranmer, who could not bring himself to say it aloud, and instead left a letter for the king in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court on All Souls' Day, 1541. Henry's first reaction was disbelief. He ordered a discreet investigation to clear her name. The 72nd thing is what the investigation found instead, that during the summer progress of 1541, the Queen had been meeting privately with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's own privy chamber, arranged with the help of Lady Rochford, who was the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother. There survives a letter from Catherine to Culpeper. It is one of the very few things we have in her own words. She writes that it makes her heart die to think she cannot always be in his company, and she signs it, "Yours as long as life endures." She was, at the most generous estimate, 20 years old. The 73rd thing is what happened at Hampton Court, and I'll tell it as what it is, a story that may have grown in the telling. It is said that when she learned Henry had been informed, she broke free from her guards and ran down the gallery toward the chapel where he was hearing Mass, screaming for him, and was seized and dragged back before she reached the door. The corridor is still called the Haunted Gallery, and people have reported hearing things there for centuries. The historical evidence for the run is thin. It appears in later accounts, not contemporary ones. But something happened in that palace in November 1541, and whatever it was, he never spoke to her again. The 74th thing is that Culpeper and Derham were executed in December 1541. Derham suffered the full traitor's death. Culpeper was granted beheading, and Catherine and Lady Rochford were condemned by attainder and executed at the Tower on the 13th of February, 1542. There's a report, again later rather than contemporary, that she asked for the block to be brought to her room the night before, so she could practice laying her head on it properly. Whether or not that happened, the fact that people believed it says something about how the death of a frightened teenage girl sat in the national memory. The 75th thing is that Parliament then passed a law making it treason for a woman with a sexual history to marry the king without disclosing it, which raised, as courtiers reportedly joked at the time, an obvious practical difficulty for the future, since no woman of any experience would now dare accept him. The 76th thing is the execution that even Henry's admirers struggle with. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, the last of the true Plantagenets, the old royal line the Tudors had replaced. Her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, had written a blistering attack on Henry from the safety of Italy. Henry could not reach the son. He reached the mother. She was held in the Tower for over 2 years, in conditions cold enough that Catherine Howard had sent her warm clothing. and on the 27th of May, 1541, aged 67, she was taken out to a small block in the morning and beheaded by an inexperienced axeman, and the reports of how badly it went are among the worst things in the century. The 77th thing is the last wife, and she is easily the most impressive. Catherine Parr was around 31 when she married Henry in July 1543, and she had already been widowed twice. She was in love with Thomas Seymour, Jane's brother, and had to set that aside when the king made his intentions clear, later writing that God had withstood her will. She was a genuinely serious religious reformer, and she was a published author. Her book, Prayers or Meditations, came out in 1545, making her the first English woman to publish an original work in English under her own name. A second and much bolder book, The Lamentation of a Sinner, appeared after Henry's death. The 78th thing is that she very nearly went the way of the others. In 1546, conservatives at court, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, worked on Henry's suspicion of her religious views. A warrant for her arrest was drawn up. The story, reported by John Fox, who is not a neutral witness, so hold it loosely, is that the document was dropped in a corridor, found, and brought to her, and she collapsed in terror. And then she did the only thing that could have saved her. She went to Henry and told him that she was only a woman with all the imperfections of her sex, and that if she had ever argued theology with him, it had been to distract him from the pain in his leg and to learn from his answers. And he said, by Fox's account, "Is it so, sweetheart?" And then we are friends again. When the guards came the next day to arrest her, they found the king and queen sitting together in the garden, and Henry sent them away with language that would not be suitable for tonight. She survived him by less than 2 years, dying in 1548 after childbirth. All that skill, all that intelligence, all that nerve. And in the end, the same thing that killed Elizabeth of York, and Jane Seymour killed her too. Let's slow right down, now, and look at the man himself, the body, the household, the daily texture of it. This is the part that most people never hear, and it's where he becomes real. The 79th thing is that we can measure him, because his armor survives. There's a suit made for him around 1512, when he was in his early 20s, and there is field armor from the 1540s, and both are in the royal armories. The young man's waist measures somewhere in the low 30s in inches. The older man's is around 52, with a chest close to 55. That is not a metaphor for decline. That is a physical object in a museum in Leeds that you can walk up to. He went from an athlete's body to something that could barely move under its own power, and the steel recorded it. The 80th thing is the leg. In 1527, and again in 1528, he had trouble with a sore on his leg, and from the mid-1530s onward it became chronic. An ulcer, probably on the thigh or shin, possibly both legs eventually. The most common modern suggestion is a varicose ulcer or osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection, perhaps set off or aggravated by the jousting falls. It would close over, and then the infection trapped underneath would build until he was in agony, and at times speechless and black in the face. And then the surgeons would open it again to let it drain, and the relief would come. It had to be kept open deliberately. There were dressings, and there was constant smell. By the last years, he was too heavy and too lame to climb stairs, and engineers built him devices described in the accounts as chairs, trams essentially, to be hauled up and down between floors at Whitehall and Greenwich. 2 of them. The 81st thing is that he was his own physician, more or less. There is a manuscript in the British Library containing prescriptions for plasters and ointments, several of which are described as devised by the King's own Majesty, to heal ulcers, to take away inflammations, to dry and comfort. He mixed remedies. He discussed his symptoms with his doctors at length. Whether any of it helped is another matter. Some of the ingredients in 16th century wound treatment would horrify a modern nurse. The 82nd thing is his terror of illness, which was real and lifelong. When the sweating sickness swept England in 1528, a disease that could kill a healthy adult between breakfast and supper, and which has never been definitively identified, Henry fled. He moved constantly between houses, sometimes several times in a week, took his own remedies, and reduced his household to a handful of attendants. Anne Boleyn caught it and survived. Her brother-in-law died. Henry wrote her worried letters and sent his second-best physician. Since his best one was away, a king who would gamble his skull in a tilt-yard was terrified of an infection he couldn't see. That's not a contradiction. That's exactly how fear works. The 83rd thing is a job title that people always find hard to believe. There was a post at court called the Groom of the Stool. Its holder was responsible for attending the king in the privy, for the close stool, a padded velvet-covered box, and for what happened at it, including the water and the cloths. And it was one of the most powerful positions in England, because the man who did that job was alone with the king daily, in an unguarded moment, and could speak to him without an audience. Sir Henry Norris held it. So did others who became enormously influential. Access was a power, and nobody had more access than the man holding the towel. The 84th thing is the food, and the scale of it is difficult to take in. The kitchens at Hampton Court occupy something like 50 rooms, and produced, at full stretch, meals for a court of 600 or more, twice a day. Estimates of annual consumption run to well over 1,000 oxen and many thousands of sheep, along with deer, boar, poultry, and vast quantities of fish. And beer. Beer was the everyday drink for everyone, at something like a gallon a day per person, because it was safer than water. The brewhouse was one of the largest departments in the building. The 85th thing is a detail from the household regulations that says everything about managing hundreds of people in a building with no plumbing. There were repeated official orders forbidding staff from relieving themselves in the corridors, courtyards, and fireplaces. The rules had to be reissued, which tells you that the rules were being ignored. The Great Palace, the cloth of gold, the Holbein portraits, and somebody urinating in the hearth. The 86th thing is the palaces themselves. At his death, Henry owned something in the region of 60 houses and palaces, more than any English monarch before or since. Some he built. Many he took. Hampton Court from Wolsey, York Place from the Sea of York, which he rebuilt as Whitehall until it became the largest palace in Europe, sprawling over some 23 acres with well over 1,000 rooms. And then there was Nonsuch, begun in 1538 in Surrey, so called because there was supposed to be none such like it anywhere. It was a fantasy of turrets and painted stucco panels of gods and emperors, and to build it, he demolished the village of Cuddington and its church, and cleared the inhabitants out. Nonsuch is gone, It was given away in the following century, ended up with a royal mistress, and was pulled down for its materials in the 1680s. There is nothing left above ground. A palace, built to be unmatched, dismantled for building supplies within 150 years. The 87th thing is the Navy, which is his most durable legacy, and the one he'd probably be least annoyed to be remembered for. He inherited a handful of ships and left something like 50. He founded the dockyards at Woolwich and Deptford. He built the Great Harry, Henry Grace-Adieu, a vast prestige warship. And he pushed the shift toward heavy guns firing broadside through ports cut into the hull, which changed naval warfare permanently. He also created the administrative body that became the Navy Board. The institution outlasted him by centuries. The 88th thing is the Mary Rose, and it's the closest we can get to standing inside his world. She was one of his early warships, launched around 1511, and on the 19th of July, 1545, in the Battle of the Solent against a French invasion fleet, she heeled over and sank in sight of the shore. Henry was watching from Southsea Castle. Most of the crew, the great majority of perhaps 500 men, drowned, trapped under anti-boarding netting rigged over the deck. She was raised on the 11th of October, 1982, in front of a live television audience of millions, and she is in a museum in Portsmouth now, with tens of thousands of objects recovered from the silt. Longbows still strung with their staves intact. A barber-surgeon's chest with its wooden ointment canisters. Combs with lice still in the teeth. A backgammon set. Leather shoes. A dog. There was a dog on board. They found the skeleton near the carpenter's cabin. He was probably there to kill rats. The 89th thing is the Bible, and it's the Reformation's most lasting physical object in England. In 1539, the Great Bible was published, an English translation overseen by Miles Coverdale, and Henry's injunctions required a copy to be set up in every parish church in the country for people to read. Think about what that meant. For the first time, an ordinary, literate person in an English village could walk in and read scripture in their own language, legally, chained to a desk at the back of the church. And Henry then had second thoughts, because people were reading it and arguing about it loudly in church. And an act was passed in 1543, restricting who was permitted to read it. Noblemen and gentlemen could. Merchants' wives could not. And laboring men and women were excluded altogether. He opened the door and then tried to narrow it. It was far too late. The 90th thing is his own books, because he was a real reader and he wrote in the margins. His personal psalter survives in the British Library, illuminated by the French artist Jean Mallard, and it contains images of Henry as King David, playing the harp, reading in his bedchamber with his spectacles and his slippers. And in his own hand, beside a verse about the sorrows of old age, he has written a note in Latin about how painful a thing this is. That's about as close as we get to hearing him alone with himself. The 91st thing is his jester, Will Somers, who was the only person in England who could reportedly say almost anything to him and survive it. Somers appears in the family portraits. He's in the great dynastic painting at Hampton Court, standing at the edge with his monkey. And there are accounts of him puncturing the king's mood when nobody else dared. Cardinal Wolsey's own household knew that if Somers was in a good humor, the king would be. We have the accounts for his clothing: coats, hose, shoes, and a bill for keepers to look after him in his old age. He outlived Henry and served Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Someone had to be the last person allowed to laugh in that room. It was him. The 92nd thing is the money, and it's the least glamorous of his sins, and possibly the most damaging. To pay for the wars of the 1540s, having already spent the monastic windfall, Henry debased the coinage, reducing the silver content of coins while keeping their face value. Silver was progressively replaced with copper, and on the coins his face was struck in high relief, so the raised nose wore through the thin silver wash first, showing the copper underneath. The nickname the people gave him for it was Old Copper Nose. Prices rose. Trust in the currency collapsed. It took years, well into Elizabeth's reign, to repair. The kingdom that got the church's wealth handed to it ended. The reign broke. We're coming to the end of his life now. Let it come slowly. The 93rd thing is that the last years were spent at war, and it achieved almost nothing. In 1544, Henry personally took an army to France. At 53, immobile, hauled about in a specially made carriage, and besieged and captured Boulogne. It was the one thing he had wanted since he was 17, a French town taken by him. Holding it cost a fortune. And in 1550, 3 years after his death, the town was sold back to France by his son's government because England could not afford to keep it. At the same time, he was prosecuting a brutal campaign in Scotland, the raids that came to be called the Rough Wooing, an attempt to force a marriage between his son Edward and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. Edinburgh was burned. Border towns and abbeys were destroyed. The marriage never happened. Mary was sent to France instead. The 94th thing is what he did to the crown itself, in constitutional terms, and it's easy to miss because it isn't dramatic. In 1536 and 1542, Acts of Parliament formally united Wales with England, giving Welsh counties representation at Westminster and English common law. And in 1541, the Irish Parliament declared him King of Ireland, where previous English monarchs had held only the title of Lord. Whatever you think of the consequences, and there's a great deal to think about there, the modern shape of these islands owes more to that decade than to almost any other. The 95th thing is his will, which is one of the most consequential documents in English history. He restored both his daughters to the line of succession, Mary and then Elizabeth after Edward, despite the fact that both had been declared illegitimate by his own earlier acts. He never bothered to unbastardize them. He just put them in the queue anyway. The technical contradiction sat there, and nobody dared raise it. And because of that clause, England eventually got Elizabeth I. The most consequential thing Henry ever did for England may have been an administrative afterthought about a daughter he had declared illegitimate at 3 years old. The 96th thing is the end itself. By January 1547, he was at Whitehall, enormous, in constant pain, his legs ulcerated, probably suffering from heart failure and possibly diabetes. And there was a real problem in the room. It had been made treason to predict the death of the king, so nobody could tell him he was dying. Eventually, his friend Sir Anthony Denny took the risk and told him plainly that in man's judgment he was not likely to live, and that he should prepare himself. Henry said he believed the mercy of Christ was able to pardon all his sins, though they were greater than they were. He was asked if he wanted to see a priest, and he said Cranmer, but not yet. He would sleep a little first, and then decide. By the time Cranmer arrived, he could not speak. Cranmer took his hand and asked him to give some sign that he trusted in Christ. And the king squeezed his hand. That was the last thing he did. He died in the early hours of the 28th of January, 1547. He was 55, and he had been king for 37 years and 9 months. The 97th thing is that his death, like his father's, was concealed for 3 days this time, while the men around the boy king secured control. Meals were still carried in to the empty chamber with trumpets, as though the king were about to eat. Trumpeters announcing dinner to a dead man behind a closed door. That's the last image of the reign, and I don't think anybody could have invented a better one. The 98th thing is the funeral and the story attached to it. The body was carried to Windsor over 2 days and rested overnight at Sion House, which had, before the dissolution, been an abbey. And there is a persistent tale that the coffin split during the night, and that in the morning dogs were found licking at what had leaked out. I have to be honest with you about this one. The story comes to us through Nicholas Sander, a Catholic writer of the next generation, with every reason to want it true, and it was framed as the fulfillment of a friar's prophecy years earlier, that dogs would lick Henry's blood as they had licked the blood of Ahab in the Book of Kings. There is no contemporary account. It is almost certainly propaganda, but it has stuck for 4.5 centuries, because it is exactly the ending people felt he deserved. That's how legends work. They aren't evidence about the dead. They're evidence about the living. The 99th thing is the tomb he never got. Henry had planned a monument of colossal scale and had taken over an unfinished black marble sarcophagus originally made for Cardinal Wolsey, along with bronze work by Italian sculptors. It was never completed. Edward didn't finish it. Mary didn't. Elizabeth didn't. The materials sat around for centuries and were eventually broken up or sold. And Wolsey's black sarcophagus, the one Henry had appropriated from the servant he destroyed, was finally used, in 1808, for the tomb of Admiral Lord Nelson in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. You can go and see it. The greatest naval hero in British history lies in a coffin made for a butcher's son from Ipswich and stolen by a king. So Henry was simply lowered into the vault beside Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. And for nearly 300 years, there was no proper marker at all. In 1813, the vault was opened in the presence of the Prince Regent. They were looking for Charles I, who was also in there, and they found Henry's coffin, damaged, with the lead lining broken open, and part of the skeleton visible. Today, the spot is covered by a black marble slab laid down in the reign of William IV. The lettering is plain. It lists who is underneath: Jane Seymour, King Henry VIII, King Charles I, and an infant child of Queen Anne. That's it. The most extravagant, self-monumentalizing king in English history is under a paving stone with 3 other people and a baby. And the 100th thing is the number that will not die: 72,000 executions. It comes from William Harrison's description of England, written in the 1570s and printed as part of Holinshed's Chronicles, the same Holinshed that Shakespeare mined for his plays. Harrison stated that in Henry's time, 72,000 thieves and rogues were put to death. Now, that figure would mean something like 2,000 executions a year, every year, for 37 years, in a country of perhaps 2.5 to 3 million people. It is not supported by court records, and modern historians treat it as rhetorical, a big round number meaning an enormous quantity, in a passage that was making a point about the severity of English justice generally, not compiling a statistic. What is true is bad enough without inflation. Henry executed 2 of his wives, at least 2 cardinals' worth of senior churchmen, a Lord Chancellor, his chief minister, a 67-year-old countess, and hundreds of rebels, and the treason laws under him made it possible to die for, a sentence spoken in your own house. But 72,000 is a story, and I mention it last, as the 100th thing, because it is the perfect illustration of what happened to Henry after his death. He stopped being a man and became a figure, a giant, a monster, a joke, a set of 6 wives and a turkey leg. And I want to spend the last part of tonight putting the man back, if I can, because the real one is stranger and sadder than the cartoon. There's no counting left to do now. Just let this last part drift past you. Consider what happened to the thing he spent his life building. He had wanted, above everything, a son, a male Tudor to hold the throne and keep the dynasty safe, and he got one. And it cost Jane Seymour her life, and the boy became Edward VI at 9 years old. Edward was clever, cold, and seriously committed to the Protestant faith in a way his father never had been. Henry's religious settlement was an odd, personal hybrid. Papal authority abolished, monasteries destroyed, but the Mass largely intact, and Catholic doctrine on most points still enforced. Under Edward, the reformers moved fast. The Book of Common Prayer, the stripping of altars, images pulled out of churches, wall paintings whitewashed over. Edward died in 1553, aged 15, probably of tuberculosis. He had reigned 6 years. Then came Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, who had been declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, forbidden to see her even as she was dying, and pressured into signing a document admitting that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, which she seems to have regarded ever afterward as the great sin of her life. She restored Catholicism, married Philip of Spain, and burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in 5 years, which is why history calls her what it calls her. She died in 1558, childless, having endured at least one phantom pregnancy that convinced her and her court for months that an heir was coming. And then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was executed, declared illegitimate, raised at the edge of the court, imprisoned in the Tower under her sister, and then queen for 44 years. She never married. And I don't think you need a psychology degree to wonder whether a woman who watched what marriage did to her mother, her stepmothers, and her sister might have concluded that the institution carried unacceptable risk. Here's a small thing that I find quietly moving. Elizabeth almost never spoke publicly about Anne Boleyn. It was too dangerous and too raw. But she kept close to her the Boleyn relatives, promoted her mother's kin, and, according to a persistent tradition, wore a ring that opened to reveal 2 tiny portraits, one of herself and one of a woman that most people who have examined it believe to be Anne. The ring was on her hand when she died, and was taken north to James VI of Scotland as proof of her death. She carried her mother in a locket for decades and said almost nothing. That's a whole inner life in one object. And Thomas Cranmer, who had annulled the first marriage, comforted Henry as he died, and written the English prayer book. Cranmer was tried under Mary and, under enormous pressure, signed recantations of his Protestant faith, several of them, and then, on the day of his burning in Oxford in 1556, he was brought out to make a public statement of repentance, and instead he renounced the recantations and said that the hand which had signed them should be punished first. And when the fire was lit, by the accounts of those watching, he held his right hand into the flames. Consider also the Seymours, because their story is a small, horrible epilogue. Catherine Parr, widowed, finally married Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved before Henry claimed her. And Thomas Seymour's conduct in that household toward the teenage Princess Elizabeth, who was living with them, was the subject of an investigation that makes deeply uncomfortable reading. Early morning visits to her bedchamber, romping, a dress cut to pieces in a garden. Catherine sent Elizabeth away. Then Catherine died after childbirth in 1548. Thomas Seymour was executed for treason the following year, condemned partly at the urging of his own brother, the Lord Protector, and the brother, Edward Seymour, was himself executed 2 years after that. 2 uncles of the king, dead on the block, within 3 years. The court Henry built kept running exactly as he had taught it to. Consider, too, how we see him, because the way you picture Henry VIII right now, at this moment, in your mind, was designed by one man, deliberately. In 1537, Hans Holbein painted a mural on the wall of the Privy Chamber at Whitehall Palace, Henry with his father, his mother, and Jane Seymour. And in it he did something new. He turned the king to face directly out of the picture, feet planted wide apart, shoulders enormously broadened by padded sleeves, hands away from the body, absolutely still, staring straight at the viewer. There is a contemporary account by the writer Karel van Mander saying that those who saw it were abashed and annihilated in its presence. People felt it in their bodies. And here's what happened to it. On the 4th of January, 1698, Whitehall Palace burned to the ground. A fire reportedly begun by a maidservant drying linen. Almost the entire palace was lost, including the mural. What survives is the cartoon, the full-size preparatory drawing on paper, pricked for transfer, showing Henry and his father. It's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And every image of Henry you have ever seen, every schoolbook, every playing card, every pub sign, every actor's stance in every film, descends from that pose. He commissioned an image so powerful that it beat the passage of 5 centuries, survived the destruction of its original, and still tells you what to think about him. That's not luck. That was the intention. Consider what else is still standing. At Hampton Court, you can walk through the great hall he built, with its hammer-beam roof, and see the astronomical clock installed in 1540 in the inner gatehouse, which shows the hour, the month, the phase of the moon, and the time of high water at London Bridge, because the court traveled by river and needed to know when the tide would carry them. In the courtyard, archaeologists in 2008 excavated something extraordinary. The base of a wine fountain, matching one shown in a painting of the Field of Cloth of Gold. It has been reconstructed, and on certain days it runs. There's a real tennis court on the site where he played the game, the older indoor walled version with its sloping penthouse roofs. And there's a persistent story that when the Mary Rose sank, or when Anne Boleyn was executed, he was playing tennis. The tennis stories are mostly later embroidery, but the enthusiasm was genuine. A Venetian ambassador described watching him play and said it was the prettiest thing in the world to see him at it. His fair skin glowing through a shirt of the finest texture. Consider Hever Castle in Kent, where Anne Boleyn grew up, which, as I mentioned, Henry later gave to Anne of Cleves in her settlement. 2 of the wives, 1 house. Consider that the Tower of London still has the site marked where the scaffold on Tower Green stood, with a modern memorial, a glass pillow on a circular sculpture, with the names carved around it, and that Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard both lie in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a few yards away, along with Thomas More, John Fisher, Thomas Cromwell, and Margaret Pole. The Victorians restored the chapel in the 1870s and found the remains under the floor in some disorder and reinterred them properly. Everyone who fell in this story is lying within a stone's throw of everyone else who fell in it. The chapel is small. You could stand in the middle of it and turn around slowly and take them all in. Consider, finally, how historians have argued about him, because they have never stopped. In the early 20th century, A.F. Pollard portrayed a masterful king in command of his reign. In the 1950s, Geoffrey Elton argued that the crucial work was Thomas Cromwell's, that what happened in the 1530s was a revolution in government, an administrative transformation of the English state, and that Cromwell, not Henry, was the mind behind it. Then, J.J. Scarisbrick wrote a biography in 1968 that put Henry back at the center, as a man of real intellectual seriousness and genuine driving conviction. Later writers, David Starkey, Eric Ives, Diarmaid MacCulloch, Susanna Lipscomb, have worked through the court, the wives, the archbishop, and the year of 1536 in enormous detail. And Hilary Mantel's novels did something that no historian could, which was to make the reader feel what it was like to stand in a room with him, waiting to find out which Henry had come down to breakfast. There is no settled verdict. There won't be. Every generation gets the Henry it needs, the tyrant, the reformer, the buffoon, the tragic invalid, the case study in how power damages the person who holds it. And there's one more thing worth saying about the popular version gently, because it's the version most of us met first. The rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, is a schoolroom mnemonic of relatively recent vintage, and it's not even accurate. 2 marriages were annulled, not divorced. The concept, as we understand it, didn't exist. But it's brilliant, and it's why almost everyone in the English-speaking world can list 6 women's fates in 6 words. 6 people, compressed into 6 syllables, and only 2 of them retained their own names in the public mind. Catherine of Aragon spoke 5 languages and governed England during a war. Anne Boleyn brought reformist theology into the king's own bedchamber and shaped the religious life of a country. Jane Seymour reconciled him with his eldest daughter. Anne of Cleves negotiated her own freedom and outlived them all. Catherine Howard was a child in an adult's danger. Catherine Parr published books, argued theology with the most dangerous man in England, and talked her way off a scaffold. They were not a sequence of outcomes. Let that settle. And spare a thought, before we drift much further, for the people who never appear in any of this, the ones whose religion was simply taken apart around them while they stood in it. Because that's what the Reformation looked like from a village. Not a theological argument. A series of things going missing. Consider the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, which had been the greatest pilgrimage destination in England for over 300 years. The one in the Canterbury Tales, the reason the road from London existed in the shape it did. It was reportedly encrusted with gold and jewels donated over centuries, including a famous ruby given by a French king. In 1538 it was dismantled. The treasure was carted away. The chronicles speak of wagon loads. The bones were destroyed or hidden, depending on which account you believe, and Becket's name was ordered erased from service books throughout the country. And you can still find prayer books from that period in libraries, where a 16th-century hand has obediently crossed his name out with a pen. Somebody sat down with a book they owned and struck out a saint, line by line, because they had been told to. Consider the relics, which were gathered up and publicly discredited. At Boxley Abbey in Kent, there was a famous crucifix called the Rood of Grace, and when the commissioners took it, they found, or said they found, that the figure was worked with wires and levers so that its eyes and lips could move. It was carried to London, demonstrated at Paul's Cross before a crowd, and burned. At Hales Abbey in Gloucestershire, there was a phial said to contain the blood of Christ, which pilgrims had come to see for centuries. The commissioners declared it to be duck's blood, or honey colored with saffron. Whether they were right, or whether the finding was decided before they arrived, is something historians still argue about. But picture being in that crowd. Whatever your view of it, something your grandmother had walked 20 miles to kneel in front of was being held up in front of you and taken apart. Consider the loss of purgatory, which sounds abstract and was in fact the most intimate change of all. In the old system, the dead were not gone. They were somewhere, being purified, and the living could help them, with masses, with prayers, with money left in wills for a priest to sing for your soul on the anniversary of your death, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Thousands of small chantry chapels existed for exactly this. Guilds maintained lights before altars for their dead members. It was an enormous, ongoing, working relationship between the living and the dead, and ordinary people had built it with their own money. When the doctrine went, all of that stopped. Under Henry, it began to wobble. Under Edward, the chantries were dissolved outright. And the practical effect was that a whole population was informed that the thing they had been doing for their mothers and fathers no longer worked and had never worked. That is a very hard thing to be told. Consider the wall paintings. Most English parish churches were not the cool, gray stone interiors we visit now. They were painted, bright, crowded, full of saints and doom paintings, over the chancel arch showing the Last Judgment, the Blessed Rising on one side, and the damned being carried off on the other. For a mostly illiterate congregation, this was the visual world of religion. It was whitewashed over. And here is the lovely thing. Whitewash preserves. In church after church, restorers in the 19th and 20th centuries stripped the limewash back and found the paintings underneath, faded. But there's one at Pickering in Yorkshire, another at Chaldon in Surrey. They were hidden by the people who were told to destroy them, and hiding is what saved them. Somebody, in 1547, painted over a picture rather than scraping it off. We don't know if it was kindness or laziness or hope, but the effect was preservation. Consider also who profited, because this is why it stuck. The monastic lands did not stay with the crown. They were sold quickly and in enormous quantity to gentry, and merchants and lawyers and courtiers. Thousands of families across England acquired estates that had belonged to the church. And once you have bought an abbey's farmland, you have a permanent, personal, financial stake in the Reformation never being reversed. That is the real reason England did not go back. Not theology. Deeds of sale. When Mary tried to restore Catholicism, she found she could not undo the land settlement, because a large part of the political nation was sitting on it. Consider what happened to the buildings themselves. Some became parish churches and survive, Tewkesbury, Selby, Sherborne, because a town bought its abbey church and kept it. Some became private houses, and you can still find them, with a cloister turned into a hallway, and a monk's dormitory turned into a bedroom. Some were quarried. The stone of a great abbey turns up in field walls and farmhouses for miles around, and a very few, like Glastonbury, were left as they fell. Its last abbot, Richard Whiting, an old man, was convicted in a trial whose outcome appears to have been decided in advance, dragged on a hurdle to the top of Glastonbury Tor, and hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head was set over the abbey gate. That was in November 1539. The abbey had existed in some form for something like 800 years. Consider finally the ones who died on both sides, because that's the detail that shows you what kind of settlement this was. In July 1540, 2 days after Thomas Cromwell's execution, 6 men were drawn on hurdles to Smithfield. 3 were Protestants, burned as heretics for denying Catholic doctrine. 3 were Catholics, hanged as traitors for denying the royal supremacy. They were dragged out together, in pairs, one of each. That is Henry's church in a single afternoon. You could die for going too far, and you could die for not going far enough, and the distance between the two was whatever the king currently thought. Foreign observers found it incomprehensible. One reportedly remarked that those who were against the Pope were burned, and those who were for him were hanged. There are a few small things left that I don't want to leave out, and they're the softest ones, the ordinary texture of a life that we mostly remember for its catastrophes. Let them go by however you like. His account books survive in part, and they are wonderful. The Privy Purse expenses record what the king actually spent his loose money on, and it's not what you'd guess. There are payments to ordinary people who brought him gifts, someone who brought cherries, someone who brought a carp, someone who brought puddings, because the custom was that the bearer of a gift received a reward, and the clerk wrote down every one. There are gambling losses, substantial ones. He played cards, dice, tennis, and bowls for money, and he lost regularly enough that it's recorded with a certain resigned regularity. There are payments to musicians and to fools and to children who sang for him. And there are payments for lost dogs. He kept greyhounds and spaniels, and dogs kept getting away, and the accounts record small sums given to people who brought the king's dog back. The collars survive in inventories, velvet, embroidered, some with the royal arms. The most feared man in England, paying a stranger a few pence for returning a spaniel. The court moved constantly, and that's something people forget. In summer, the king went on progress. The entire household, hundreds of people, wagons, beds, plate, tapestries, packed up and carried from house to house. Partly it was politics. Being seen mattered, and staying with great subjects reminded them who they were. But partly it was hygiene. A house occupied by hundreds of people with no sewerage became, in the frank language of the time, unsweet. So you left, and while you were gone, the house was cleaned and aired and the drains flushed, and then, in a few months, you came back. The floors were strewn with rushes and herbs, meadowsweet, lavender, which were swept out and replaced. Erasmus wrote a famously disgusted description of English floors, where the bottom layer went unchanged for decades, accumulating everything you'd rather not think about. He may have exaggerated. He usually did. But nobody at the time contradicted him. Clothing was legislated. There were sumptuary laws specifying exactly who could wear what. Purple silk and cloth of gold reserved to the royal family, sable to the highest ranks, velvet of certain colors to certain incomes. What you wore was a legible statement of your position, enforceable by law. You could be fined for dressing above yourself, which makes the portraits more interesting when you look at them again. Every fabric in every painting is a legal claim. New Year was the great gift-giving day, not Christmas, and the exchanges were recorded on long parchment rolls. Courtiers gave the king jewels, plate, purses of gold coins, embroidered shirts. He gave back gilt cups and bowls, weighed and valued precisely, with the weight noted beside each name. It was a system of obligation dressed up as generosity, and everybody understood the arithmetic exactly. There is a New Year's gift record from early in the reign showing Catherine of Aragon giving him a shirt she had worked herself. And there is a much-repeated story that when Anne Boleyn was in the ascendant, Catherine went on sending him shirts she had sewn, and Anne was furious about it. Christmas at court ran the full 12 days, with a Lord of Misrule appointed to preside over the revels, an officer of chaos, licensed to invert the order of things for a season. There were disguisings and masks, in which the king and his companions would burst into a room in costume, dance with the ladies, and then dramatically unmask, to universal astonishment that was, one assumes, extremely well rehearsed. He loved that. He did it constantly. And knowing what we know about Rochester and Anne of Cleves, you can see the whole tragedy of his later life inside that harmless game. A man who had spent 30 years being recognized with delight the moment he took the mask off, walking into a room where nobody knew him. The Chapel Royal under Henry was one of the finest musical establishments in Europe, and among the men who served in it was Thomas Tallis, who managed the almost unbelievable feat of writing sacred music through Henry's break with Rome, Edward's Protestantism, Mary's Catholic Restoration, and Elizabeth's settlement, changing language and style each time, and keeping his position and his head throughout. If you ever want a piece of music to fall asleep to that connects directly to this world, Tallis is where I'd send you. There were clocks, and they were the technology of the age. Astronomical dials, table clocks, spring-driven pieces from German workshops. There is a small gilt clock in the royal collection, with a weight bearing the initials H and A, and true love knots, and the mottos of Henry and Anne Boleyn, traditionally said to have been a gift from him to her. And there were spectacles. He owned them. They appear in his inventories, and he is shown wearing them in that Psalter illumination. An old man in a nightcap, sitting up in bed with a book, reading with glasses on. That's not the Holbein image. That's the other one. Both are him. He kept a library that ran to several thousand volumes across his palaces, and the inventories recorded in detail. He annotated. He argued in margins. and when the monasteries came down, their libraries were dispersed, and much was lost. The greatest destruction of manuscripts in English history. Though the antiquary John Leland was commissioned to travel the country and record what was in them, and his lists are the only trace we have of a great many books that no longer exist. He was, at the same moment, the man who destroyed the libraries, and the man who sent someone to write down what had been in them. That contradiction is, I think, the closest thing to a summary of him that I can offer. And here is the last small thing. In the great dynastic portrait that hangs at Hampton Court, painted around 1545, Henry sits enthroned in the center with Prince Edward at his knee. On his right sits Jane Seymour, who had been dead for 8 years when it was painted. She is there as the mother of the heir, restored to the picture, because the picture is not about who was alive. It's about the shape he wanted the world to have. Mary stands to one side. Elizabeth stands to the other, in a doorway at the edge. Elizabeth is 11 or 12 in that painting, standing at the margin of her father's family portrait, in the frame, but not at the center of it. Nobody in that room could have known that she was the one who would matter most. Before we let go of all this, I want to give you one last thing to hold, which is what it actually felt like to be near him. Because that's the part the portraits can't tell you, and the chroniclers mostly didn't dare write down. There's a story from William Roper, who was Thomas More's son-in-law and lived in his house, so he's about as close to a first-hand source as we get. He describes the king coming to dinner at More's house at Chelsea, unannounced, walking in the garden with him afterward for an hour with his arm around More's neck. And Roper, who was young, was thrilled. He said to his father-in-law afterward how wonderful it was, how the king had never done as much for anyone, how familiar he was with him. And More said, quietly, and Roper never forgot it, that he thanks our Lord, he finds his grace a very good Lord indeed, and he believes he does as singularly favor him as any subject in the realm. However, son Roper, he said, I have no cause to be proud of it, for if my head would win him a castle in France, it should not fail to go. That was in the 1520s. His head came off in 1535. He knew. Everyone who was any good at surviving that court knew. The affection was real, and it was worth precisely nothing. There is a remark attributed to Henry himself, and I'll pass it on with the caution that it comes down to us second-hand, that if he thought his cap knew his counsel, he would cast it into the fire. Whether he said it in those words or not, everyone who dealt with him behaved as if it were true. The Duke of Norfolk, a man who survived Henry by pure luck, condemned to death, and saved only because the king died the night before the sentence could be carried out, is reported to have said that the wrath of the prince is death. Ambassadors' letters from the last decade have a particular quality to them. If you read a lot of them together, they watch him the way you'd watch weather. They report his moods. They note when he is merry, and when he is not to be approached, and who was in favor on Tuesday and out by Friday. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, spent years in that court and wrote thousands of pages. And he is our single richest source precisely because he was an outsider, taking notes on people who could not afford to. And the strangest thing of all, the thing that I keep coming back to, is that Henry appears to have believed sincerely and continuously that he was a good man badly served. When Wolsey failed, it was Wolsey's fault. When the annulment stalled, it was the Pope's fault, and then Catherine's stubbornness. When Anne did not produce a son, she had bewitched him into the marriage in the first place. When Cromwell's German marriage went wrong, Cromwell had deceived him. When Catherine Howard betrayed him, he wept in front of his council and blamed them for choosing her. There is no surviving moment, not one, where he says, "This was mine, and I did it." I don't say that to condemn him, particularly. I say it because it's the thing that made him so dangerous, and because it's a very ordinary human failing scaled up to the size of a kingdom. Most of us, given absolute power and unlimited flattery, and no one on earth permitted to tell us we are wrong, would not do better. That's an uncomfortable thought, and it's one of the reasons this story never loses its grip. So let all of it settle now. Think of the shape of it. A second son, kept behind a window, whose brother died. A boy who got the throne at 17 with the whole of England sighing with relief, called the Hope of Europe, praised by scholars, writing songs about pastime with good company. A man who wrote a book for the Pope and was given a title for it that is still on the coins today. And then 30 years of grinding, and a leg that would not heal, and a series of women who could not give him the one thing he'd decided God required, and a church broken in half, and 800 monasteries stripped, and a chapel at the Tower filling up with people he had loved. He died in a bed at Whitehall, in the dark of a January morning, holding an archbishop's hand because he could no longer speak, and for 3 days afterward, trumpets sounded, and dinner was carried into a room where nobody was eating. All of that was 500 years ago, and the odd thing is how much of it is still touchable. The armor is in Leeds, and you can see the waist widen. The ship is in Portsmouth, with the lice still in the combs. The drawing is in the National Portrait Gallery, bricked with pinholes, so you can see how the image was transferred to the wall. The black marble that was meant to be his tomb is under Nelson in St. Paul's. The clock is still turning on the gatehouse at Hampton Court, still telling you the time of high water at London Bridge, for a court that stopped traveling by river a very long time ago. None of it was preserved on purpose. It survived by accident, the way most things do. A fire that missed one room, a drawing that was kept because paper was expensive, a ship in the mud, a slab in a chapel floor. You don't need to hold on to any of it. Not the dates, not the wives, not the acts of Parliament. Let it all go loose now. If one thing floats up tomorrow, the boy answering Erasmus, or the shirt Catherine sewed, or the dog on the Mary Rose, then that was the one meant for you, and the rest can sink back down. There's nothing to decide tonight. No oath to swear, no letter to answer, nobody watching your face to see which way you'll go. Somewhere in Windsor there's a chapel with a black slab in the floor, and it's quiet in there tonight. And it has been quiet for a very long time. Let your breathing slow. Let the candles go out one by one down the long gallery. Sleep well.